Have you ever felt the hair on the back of your neck rise just by hearing a melody? Imagine a song so ancient, so haunting, that it feels alive, like it's watching you, pulling you into its grasp. This isn't just a melody, it's a trap, a curse, and a mystery that has claimed the sanity of anyone who dared to listen. Meet Arthur Castellan, a seasoned musicologist with a reputation for uncovering the darkest secrets hidden in the world's forgotten songs. Arthur receives an unmarked package one cold evening, with nothing but an old vinyl record and a cryptic note scrawled in shaky handwriting. It awakens. Beware! Arthur hesitates, but feels a strange compulsion to play the record. As the needle hits the vinyl, the room seems to darken slightly, the shadows elongating unnaturally along the walls. A slow, mournful tune begins, its notes sharp and discordant yet strangely hypnotic. A chill creeps into the air, and Arthur suddenly realizes the music doesn't echo the way it should. The sound feels intimate, as if each note is being whispered directly into his ears. Halfway through the song, Arthur notices something even stranger. The faint sound of breathing layered beneath the melody, steady, deliberate, and too close to be his own. When the song ends, Arthur is left in silence, but it isn't peace he feels. The room seems charged, heavy with an invisible weight pressing down on him. The record player abruptly shuts off by itself, leaving Arthur frozen in place. Moments later, the lights flicker, and a soft, almost imperceptible hum begins to fill the room, as if the melody had left an imprint in the air. That's when he notices it, on the wall opposite him. The shadows have taken the shape of something humanoid, standing perfectly still, facing him. Panicking, Arthur rushes to turn on more lights, only to find that the shadow figure has vanished. But the air remains cold, and there's a lingering scent of something metallic, like blood. Arthur's rational mind tells him it was just a trick of the light, a coincidence brought on by his imagination. But deep inside, he knows this isn't true. The melody isn't just a song, it's something alive, something watching, waiting. And so begins Arthur's journey into the unknown, driven by his insatiable curiosity and an unshakable fear that the record didn't find its way to him by accident. What did the note mean by "It Awakens"? What is the true purpose of this haunting song? And more importantly, has Arthur already heard too much? Before we dive deeper into this chilling mystery, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your theories in the comments. Trust me, you'll want someone to talk to after hearing the full story. Arthur Castellan couldn't sleep that night. The melody played over and over in his head, every note etched into his memory like a brand. He had tried to distract himself, reading, drinking tea, even running water to drown out the lingering hum in his ears, but nothing worked. It was as if the music had rewired his brain, replacing silence with its haunting cadence. Finally, exhaustion overtook him, and Arthur fell into a restless sleep, though he would later wish he hadn't. In the dream, he stood in the heart of an unfamiliar forest. The trees were unnaturally tall and twisted, their skeletal branches reaching into a dark, starless sky. The air was heavy, suffocating, carrying the faint scent of decayed wood and something metallic, just like before. At first, there was silence, a void so complete that it made his ears ache. Then came the sound, faint and distant, as if the forest itself were exhaling a mournful tune. It was the melody, but now it felt wrong. Slower, distorted, as if dragging itself through the air toward him. Arthur tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, rooted to the forest floor. The song grew louder, closer, and with it came whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. He spun around, searching for their source, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. Yet the whispers grew more urgent, overlapping until they were a cacophony of voices, each clawing at his sanity. Among them, one word stood out, clear and sharp as a knife: listen. The forest began to shift around him, the trees bending unnaturally, creating a narrow path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Against his better judgment, Arthur felt compelled to follow it. As he walked, the whispers became rhythmic, almost synchronized with the melody, as though the forest itself was breathing in tune. His heartbeat quickened, matching the unnatural rhythm. The path ended abruptly in a small clearing where a circle of stones surrounded an ancient gramophone. Its horn was cracked, and vines coiled around its base like veins. The gramophone played the melody, its notes sharp and grating in the eerie silence. Arthur felt a chill crawl up his spine as he noticed something horrifying. The air in the clearing was alive. It shimmered and rippled, as though something unseen were watching him, moving just beyond his perception. Then he heard it, breathing slow and deliberate, but it wasn't his own. Arthur's chest tightened as the whispers returned, now louder, forming words in an unknown language that felt ancient, primal. The gramophone's needle skipped, and the melody twisted into a crescendo of dissonance. The whispers stopped, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the scream, a long, agonizing wail that erupted from nowhere and everywhere at once. Arthur jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding violently in his chest. His hands trembled as he reached for the light, but his room was no longer the same. On the walls, faint but unmistakable, were markings, symbols carved in a language he couldn't decipher. And on his desk, where the record had been, lay a single, withered black rose. The dream had been too vivid, too real. Arthur knew he wasn't safe, not even in his own mind. The song wasn't just haunting him, it was changing him. As the air in his room grew colder, Arthur realized he had only one option. He had to find out where this melody came from and what it truly meant. Little did he know, his descent into madness had only just begun. Arthur spent the next day obsessively researching the symbols he had seen carved on his walls. They seemed ancient, yet no language or script he consulted matched them. The deeper he delved, the more fragmented his thoughts became. The melody had carved itself into his mind, looping endlessly, each note burrowing deeper into his subconscious. It was no longer just a haunting tune. It was a presence lingering just out of sight, shaping his thoughts in ways he couldn't explain. Determined to uncover the truth, Arthur decided to return to the record, convinced it held more answers. He placed the vinyl on the player once again, this time equipped with a recording device to capture every detail. The melody began as before, haunting, mournful, and impossibly beautiful. But as the music played, Arthur noticed something new. Hidden beneath the notes, faint but unmistakable, was a voice. It was speaking in that same ancient language, its tone guttural and deliberate, as though chanting a ritual. Arthur leaned in closer, adjusting the volume, his breath shallow as he strained to make out the words. The air around him grew heavier, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. He shivered, glancing at the corners of the room, where shadows seemed to pulse unnaturally with the rhythm of the song. The voice grew louder, clearer, but the words were still incomprehensible, until suddenly, for the briefest moment, it switched to English. "You cannot escape. You were chosen." Arthur recoiled, his pulse racing. He stopped the record and rewound the recording, desperate to confirm what he had heard. But the voice was gone. Only the melody remained, as if mocking his fear. His skin prickled with unease. The words weren't random, they were meant for him. Later that night, Arthur ventured into the village of Rivenwell, hoping to find someone who could shed light on the melody's origins. The villagers, however, were tight-lipped, their faces pale with fear at the mere mention of the song. He managed to corner an elderly woman at the local pub, her trembling hands clutching a cup of tea. "The song," she whispered, barely audible, "wasn't meant to be heard. It's a calling." "A calling for what?" Arthur asked, but the woman shook her head violently, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't listen to it again," she hissed. "It sees you now. It sees all of us." Before he could press her further, she abruptly stood and left, her footsteps hurried as though she feared the very walls might overhear their conversation. As Arthur walked back to his lodgings, the wind picked up, carrying a faint hum through the air. It was the melody, faint yet unmistakable, as if the wind itself was singing. He froze in his tracks, his heart pounding. The melody wasn't coming from his mind. It was outside, real and alive. He looked around, but the village was deserted, the streets bathed in cold moonlight. The sound grew louder, circling him, and then came the whispers, just like in his dream. Panic set in as Arthur stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut behind him. But the melody followed, its presence inescapable. The record player was off, yet the tune filled the air, seeping into every corner of the room. Shadows began to move again, taking shape, twisting into forms that resembled people but weren't quite human. Arthur's breath hitched as one of them stepped closer, its outline flickering like a flame. "You were chosen," it whispered in a voice that wasn't a voice, the words reverberating inside his skull. Arthur backed into the wall, his legs trembling. The shadow tilted its head, as if studying him, before melting back into the darkness. The melody faded, leaving Arthur alone in the oppressive silence. He sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The warnings, the whispers, the visions, it was all connected. This wasn't just a song, it was a doorway. And Arthur, whether he liked it or not, had begun to open it. The question now was, what would come through? Arthur Castellan sat in his dimly lit room, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. His mind raced with fragments of the melody, the whispers, and the cryptic warnings from the villagers. He couldn't shake the feeling that the song was alive, an entity weaving itself into his very being. Against his better judgment, he decided to listen to the record one last time, desperate for clarity, or perhaps for closure. As he lowered the needle onto the vinyl, the room seemed to shift. The shadows that clung to the corners stretched outward, creeping along the walls like liquid darkness. The melody began softly, but its mournful tone carried an edge of malice, as if it mocked his fear. This time, however, something was different. The voice from before, the guttural ancient chanting, returned, but now it was layered with a chorus of whispers. The whispers overlapped, their words unintelligible, but they carried a tone of urgency, as if warning him, pleading with him to stop. Arthur's heartbeat quickened as the song reached a crescendo, the dissonance between the notes clawing at his sanity. The air grew thick, suffocating, and a low vibration coursed through the room, rattling the windows and shaking the furniture. Suddenly, the record player stopped, the needle scratching violently across the vinyl, filling the room with a screech that made Arthur wince. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was quickly broken by a sound that sent a chill through his spine. The faint, unmistakable hum of the melody, this time coming from outside. Arthur froze, his eyes darting toward the window. The village below was eerily quiet, bathed in the pale light of the moon. But then, in the distance, he saw it, a figure standing motionless in the middle of the street. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its edges flickering like static on a broken television. Arthur's breath caught as the figure slowly turned its head toward him, though its face was obscured. The melody grew louder, emanating not from the figure, but from everywhere at once. Arthur stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding, when he noticed something even more horrifying. The shadowy figure wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the darkness, stepping out from alleyways, doorways, and the forest that surrounded the village. Their movements were unnatural, jerky and disjointed, as if they were marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. They began to converge on his lodging, their forms growing clearer with each step. Arthur could now make out faint outlines of faces, contorted in expressions of anguish and terror, their mouths moving as if singing silently. Desperate, Arthur grabbed the record, intending to destroy it. But as he held it in his hands, the vinyl grew cold, colder than ice, burning his skin. He dropped it with a gasp, and the melody surged to a deafening roar, as if the record was fighting back. The shadows in the room grew darker, denser, and began to take shape. One of them loomed over him, its form barely human. It extended a shadowy hand, pointing at the record, before whispering in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the earth. "Finish the song." Arthur shook his head violently, his voice trembling as he muttered, No, I can't." But the shadow advanced, its presence pressing against him like an invisible weight. The walls around him seemed to ripple, bending inward as if the room itself was alive, trapping him. The melody was no longer just a sound, it was a force, a living entity demanding to be heard. Terrified, Arthur placed the record back on the player, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The moment the needle touched the vinyl, the shadows recoiled, gathering into a swirling mass at the center of the room. The melody resumed, louder and more dissonant than ever, each note slicing through the air like a blade. Arthur's vision blurred, and the room seemed to dissolve around him. He found himself back in the forest from his dreams, but this time, it was more vivid, more real. The gramophone was there, playing the same cursed melody, but now it was surrounded by the shadowy figures. They formed a circle, their movements synchronized with the music, their mouths singing the words Arthur couldn't understand. At the center of the circle, the ground split open, revealing a gaping void filled with writhing tendrils of darkness. Arthur tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figures turned toward him in unison, their empty eyes glowing faintly. The chant grew louder, and from the void emerged a towering presence, its form shifting and incomprehensible, like a living nightmare. It reached for him, and Arthur felt his mind unraveling, his thoughts dissolving into chaos. With a sudden jolt, Arthur woke up in his room, gasping for air. The record player was off, the record shattered into pieces on the floor. But the melody still lingered in his mind, and on his arm, burned into his skin, was a mark, one of the symbols from his dream. Arthur realized with chilling certainty that the nightmare hadn't ended. It had only just begun. Arthur awoke in a cold sweat, his body trembling as the echoes of the nightmare clung to his mind. The searing pain in his arm brought his attention to the strange mark burned into his skin, a jagged, looping symbol that matched the ones from his dreams. It was no illusion, it pulsed faintly, almost as if alive. His first instinct was to cover it, but even the touch of his shirt sent waves of discomfort rippling through his nerves. Driven by fear and desperation, Arthur pored over every book, journal, and scrap of research he had on ancient languages and forbidden folklore. Hours blurred into days as he sifted through countless pages, but none offered an answer. Yet something gnawed at the back of his mind, a memory half-formed of an obscure text he had encountered years ago. The book had been dismissed by most scholars as nonsense, riddled with myths about cursed songs and rituals tied to the human psyche. Arthur tracked the book to an old university archive, deep within its forgotten basement shelves. The air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew clinging to the worn pages of the tomes. There it was, the echoes beyond, a crumbling volume bound in faded leather. The text spoke of a melody that wasn't merely a song, but a bridge. The melody was said to thin the veil between worlds, inviting entities from beyond human comprehension to cross into our reality. Those who heard it became marked, bound to the song's will, serving as conduits for these otherworldly forces. Arthur's pulse quickened as he read on, discovering that the song had surfaced before, leaving destruction in its wake. Villages had vanished, their inhabitants driven mad, speaking only in fragments of the melody. Survivors reported shadowy figures stalking them, whispering promises of power and knowledge at a cost. The most chilling part of the text described the mark. Those who bore it were forever tied to the melody, their minds slowly unraveling until they were no longer human. Arthur's thoughts spiraled as he realized he wasn't just researching a myth, he was living it. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the mark on his arm, it all matched. He desperately wanted to believe it was coincidence, but the weight of evidence crushed his hope. Worse still, the text spoke of an ancient village where the melody had first emerged, Rivenwell. Arthur returned to the village library, now determined to uncover its hidden history. The librarian, an elderly man with a grave expression, hesitated when Arthur asked about Rivenwell's past. After a long silence, he retrieved a locked ledger, its leather cover scarred and brittle. "You won't like what you find," the librarian warned, his voice barely above a whisper. The ledger revealed that centuries ago, a composer named Elias Merrick had written the melody after claiming to receive it in a dream. He described it as a gift from the voices beyond, but Marek's life descended into madness shortly after. His journals recounted horrifying visions of shadowy beings and distorted landscapes, much like Arthur's own dreams. He vanished one night, and his village was left with the cursed melody, which soon spread like a plague. Arthur's breath hitched as he turned the final page, revealing a sketch of the mark now burned into his arm. Beneath it, Merrick had scrawled a chilling note: "To stop the song is to silence the voices. To silence the voices is to face them." The realization hit Arthur like a tidal wave. He wasn't just a victim of the melody, he was its next vessel. The more he listened, the deeper its hold on him would become. Yet, the only way to break free was to confront the source, whatever monstrous force lay beyond the song. The text offered no assurance of survival, only a grim truth. The melody could not be ignored. As Arthur left the library, the streets of Rivenwell felt eerily quiet. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if the village itself were holding its breath. That's when he noticed something horrifying. On the walls of the buildings and etched into the cobblestone streets were faint versions of the same symbols burned into his arm. They were everywhere, as if the village had already been claimed by the melody long ago. Arthur's hands trembled as he tried to piece together the connections. Was Rivenwell cursed, or was it a portal for the entities beyond? Every step he took back to his lodging was accompanied by the faint hum of the melody, as though the air itself had begun to sing. He knew he had little time left. The shadows had already begun to move again, and this time, they weren't waiting for him to play the record. The discovery was clear. The melody wasn't a song, it was a summoning, and Arthur had unwittingly become its herald. Arthur Castellan's world had unraveled into a nightmarish abyss. Each passing moment tightened the melody's grip on his mind, its haunting notes weaving through his thoughts like a dark thread. The mark on his arm had grown darker, its lines twisting and writhing as though alive. The once familiar streets of Rivenwell now felt foreign, cloaked in an unnatural stillness. He couldn't trust his senses anymore. Shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't, and faint whispers followed him wherever he went. Desperate for answers, Arthur sought out Elias Thorne, a reclusive historian rumored to know the village's deepest secrets. Thorne's home was tucked at the edge of the forest, an ancient structure sagging under the weight of time. The air grew colder as Arthur approached, the wind carrying the faint hum of the melody, as if warning him to turn back. Thorne was a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who greeted Arthur with a mixture of pity and fear. "You've heard it, haven't you?" Thorn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur hesitated, but the look in the man's eyes made him confess everything. The record, the mark, the shadows, the dreams. Thorn listened intently, his bony fingers tracing patterns on the surface of a wooden table. The melody isn't music, Thorn said finally. It's a doorway. It was never meant to be heard by human ears. He explained that the song was a ritual, designed by ancient mystics to summon entities from another plane of existence. These beings were not gods or spirits, but something far older and darker, creatures that existed outside the bounds of human understanding. Arthur pressed Thorn for a solution, a way to break free, but the historian's expression darkened. There's no escape once you've been marked, he said grimly. The melody binds you. It becomes a part of you, a parasite feeding on your mind. The only way to stop it is to confront its source, but... Thorn's voice trailed off, his gaze distant. But what? Arthur demanded. No one who has faced the source has ever returned, Thorn replied, his voice shaking. The melody isn't just a calling, it's a test. Those who hear it are chosen, not for salvation, but as sacrifices. Arthur's chest tightened as the weight of Thorn's words sank in. He had suspected the truth, but hearing it confirmed was a different terror altogether. His mind raced with questions, but Thorn offered little else, retreating into silence. He handed Arthur a faded map marked with symbols that mirrored the one on his arm. The song comes from the forest, Thorn whispered. Follow the map to the clearing, but be warned. What waits for you there is not of this world. Clutching the map, Arthur left Thorn's home, his resolve crumbling with every step. The forest loomed ahead, its twisted trees swaying in an unnatural rhythm, as if they too were caught in the melody's thrall. The whispers grew louder, their tones no longer just eerie but mocking, taunting him with fragments of his own fears. As he ventured deeper, the path became more treacherous. The ground was soft, almost alive, squelching beneath his boots with every step. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Strange figures appeared in his peripheral vision, flickering and dissolving before he could fully see them. He tried to focus, but the whispers began to speak directly to him, forming coherent sentences that froze his blood. Turn back. You are not ready. You were never meant to survive. Arthur's resolve wavered, but he pressed on, clutching the map tightly. The symbols on the page began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the mark on his arm. His body ached, his head throbbed, and his breathing grew labored as the forest seemed to leach the very energy from him. He stumbled into a clearing, the ground unnaturally smooth and blackened, as though scorched by some ancient fire. At its center stood an altar, carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface etched with the same writhing symbols that haunted his dreams. As Arthur approached, the melody surged to a deafening crescendo, no longer coming from within his mind but emanating from the very air around him. Shadows coalesced at the edges of the clearing, forming shapes that flickered and shifted, never fully taking form. The air was electric, heavy with an oppressive force that pressed down on him. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness, its features indistinct but its presence overwhelming. It radiated malice and curiosity, as though it were both amused and angered by Arthur's intrusion. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single voice, low, guttural, and impossibly ancient. You've come far, little vessel. But will you sing? Arthur froze, his mind racing. He understood now. This was the source, the being that had sent the melody into the world. It wasn't just a song, it was a lure, a trap set to bring him here. The voice spoke again, softer this time but no less menacing. Sing, and your suffering ends. Refuse, and your world will fall. Arthur realized with chilling clarity that the melody wasn't just calling him. It was demanding him to join it, to become a part of its eternal cycle. He stood there, trembling, as the choice loomed before him. To surrender and become one with the darkness, or to fight and face a fate far worse than death. The clearing pulsed with anticipation, the shadows closing in, and Arthur knew that whatever he chose, he would never leave this place the same. Arthur stood in the clearing, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest seemed to press in from all sides, a living entity that had been waiting for him to arrive. The shadowy figure at the altar loomed larger now, its indistinct edges rippling like smoke caught in an unfelt wind. Its presence wasn't just physical, it seeped into Arthur's thoughts, twisting them, pulling at the frayed edges of his sanity. Sing, the figure commanded again, its voice a guttural symphony of overlapping tones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The air around Arthur pulsed with the melody, louder than ever, as if the clearing itself was alive with its sinister rhythm. His hands trembled, the mark on his arm burning like fire, its lines writhing and spreading as though trying to consume him. "I won't," Arthur muttered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive hum. The shadow figure tilted its head, as if amused by his defiance. "You misunderstand," it said, its voice taking on a mocking edge. "This is not a request. The song has already chosen you. You are its vessel, its herald. To deny it is to deny yourself." Arthur clutched his head, the melody drilling into his thoughts, fragments of his past flashing before his eyes. He saw moments he'd long forgotten, his childhood fascination with music, his obsession with uncovering the secrets of ancient songs, and finally, his discovery of the cursed record. It all felt connected, as if the melody had been calling him for his entire life. But then came a memory that didn't belong to him. A village long ago, its people gathered in this very clearing, their faces twisted with fear as they sang the melody in unison. The shadows had come for them too, consuming their minds and bodies until nothing remained but whispers on the wind. Arthur gasped, pulling himself back to the present. "This ends here," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You won't take me." The shadow figure's form wavered, its edges flaring like a dying fire. The ground beneath Arthur's feet began to crack, revealing glowing red fissures that pulsed in time with the melody. The forest around him came alive, the trees groaning and twisting as shadowy tendrils snaked toward him. In desperation, Arthur remembered the journal of Elias Merrick, the composer who had first written the melody. Merrick had scrawled a single line beneath his final entry. To silence the song, one must confront the void. The void. Arthur's gaze shifted to the altar, its obsidian surface shimmering like black water. He stepped toward it, his every instinct screaming at him to stop. The melody grew deafening, each note piercing his skull like shards of glass. The shadow figure lunged, its tendrils reaching out to stop him, but Arthur threw himself onto the altar. The moment his hands touched the cold, smooth surface, the world shifted. The clearing dissolved into darkness, an infinite void where gravity and time seemed meaningless. Arthur floated in the abyss, the melody surrounding him, no longer external but inside his very soul. Out of the darkness emerged countless figures, their forms twisted and broken, their faces familiar yet unrecognizable. They were the others who had come before him, their voices forever bound to the melody. "Join us," they whispered, their voices merging into the song. "Sing with us, and you will be free." Arthur clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "No," he said, his voice echoing through the void. "This ends with me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the shard of the broken record he had brought with him, its edges sharp enough to draw blood. With a deep breath, he pressed the shard against the mark on his arm. Pain erupted, blinding and all-consuming, as the mark flared with an intense light. The melody faltered, its rhythm breaking, and the shadow figures screamed, their forms dissolving into ash. The void trembled, and the melody shifted into a chaotic, discordant cacophony. Arthur pushed through the pain, carving the mark from his skin, his blood dripping onto the obsidian shard. The light from the mark grew brighter, burning away the shadows, until finally there was silence. Arthur collapsed, his vision fading as the void began to crumble around him. When he awoke, he was lying in the clearing, the forest eerily quiet. The altar was gone, replaced by a circle of blackened earth. The mark on his arm was nothing more than a faint scar, its power seemingly broken. But as Arthur stood, a faint hum reached his ears. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The melody was still out there, waiting for another to hear its call. Arthur staggered out of the clearing, his body battered and his mind reeling. The forest around him was deathly silent, as though nature itself was holding its breath, unsure of what had just occurred. The oppressive hum of the melody was gone, but in its absence was an equally unnerving quiet. The scar on his arm throbbed faintly, a constant reminder of the ordeal he had survived, or thought he had. As he stumbled back into Rivenwell, he found the village seemingly frozen in time. Doors were locked, windows shuttered, and no one roamed the cobblestone streets. Arthur's footsteps echoed eerily in the emptiness, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He reached the pub where he had first spoken to the old woman, but it was deserted, the chairs overturned and a thin layer of dust covering the bar. It was as though the village had been abandoned overnight. Arthur sat at one of the empty tables, his hands trembling as he tried to piece together what had happened. Had he truly broken the melody's hold, or had he simply delayed the inevitable? His thoughts spiraled as he remembered the faces in the void, their distorted forms trapped in eternal torment. Was he truly free, or had the melody marked him in ways he couldn't yet understand? His contemplation was interrupted by a faint sound, so soft it could have been imagined. It was a single note, lingering in the air like a whisper. Arthur froze, his breath caught in his throat. The note was followed by another, then another, slowly forming the beginning of the melody he thought he had silenced. He spun around, but the street behind him was empty, the shadows of the buildings stretching unnaturally long in the pale moonlight. Arthur's scar began to ache again, the faint pulse sinking with the distant melody. He ran back to the inn where he had been staying, slamming the door shut behind him. But the sound followed him, growing louder, no longer distant, but coming from within the walls themselves. The air turned cold, and the shadows in the room began to shift once more, moving with the rhythm of the cursed tune. Desperate, Arthur grabbed his belongings and fled the village. He drove through the winding roads leading away from Rivenwell, the forest on either side of him shrouded in an unnatural darkness. Yet, no matter how far he traveled, the melody lingered. It wasn't in his ears, it was in his mind, embedded like a splinter that refused to be removed. Days turned into weeks, but the melody never truly left him. At times, it was barely audible, a faint hum at the edge of his perception. At other times, it was deafening, drowning out his thoughts and driving him to the brink of madness. The scar on his arm remained, its faint glow a reminder of the void and the beings he had encountered. Arthur began to notice strange phenomena wherever he went. Lights flickered when he entered a room, and shadows seemed to stretch toward him, even in broad daylight. People avoided him, their expressions wary and fearful, as though they could sense the darkness clinging to him. He found himself waking in unfamiliar places, his memory hazy, with fragments of the melody echoing in his dreams. One evening, Arthur received a package at the motel where he was staying. There was no return address, only his name scrawled in jagged handwriting. Inside was a small, battered journal, the same one he had seen in Elias Marek's writings. Its pages were filled with frantic scrawls and disturbing sketches of shadowy figures and otherworldly symbols. On the final page was a single line, written in what appeared to be fresh ink: "The melody is never silenced. It only waits." Arthur's heart sank as he realized the truth. The melody hadn't been defeated. It had merely retreated, biding its time, searching for a new way to spread. He was no longer just a victim. He had become a part of its story, a link in its unbroken chain. In the weeks that followed, reports of strange phenomena began to surface. Villages hearing faint, untraceable melodies. People disappearing after claiming to hear music in their dreams. Arthur knew it was starting again, but this time it was spreading further, reaching places it had never touched before. One night, as he sat alone in his room, Arthur heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, no one was there. But on the ground lay another package, this one containing a single vinyl record, pristine and untouched. Written on the label, in the same jagged handwriting, were the words, "Play me." Arthur stared at the record, his hands trembling. The choice loomed before him once again. Would he play the song and confront the terror, or would he leave it untouched, risking the melody finding someone else? The room seemed to grow darker as the shadows stretched toward him, the faint hum of the melody filling the air once more. The screen fades to black as the viewer is left with one question. Would you play the record? Tell us what you would do in the comments. Would you confront the melody, or let it haunt someone else? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you awake at night. The melody isn't gone, it's waiting for you.